Live Q&A from Lansdowne Church, where we're answering the question, why is the world so broken? I'm Mike Smales, and with me is Michael Otts. This Q&A follows our guest service this morning, where Michael spoke directly into this question. That talk is now available on our YouTube channel. That's the Lansdowne Church YouTube channel. And if you want to navigate your way there, you'll find it. We'll be using the YouTube chat this morning. And so if you've got a question for Michael, just type it directly into the chat here on the side. And we'll do our best to put as many of them to him as we can in the next half an hour. Well, I've already got one or two questions for Michael, but before we get to them, Michael, perhaps you can tell us a little bit about yourselves. Where do you live? And how do you find yourself coming to answer questions like this one this morning?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Great to be with you. So I'm currently based in Marlow, Buckinghamshire. I was in Bournemouth for about, 17 years, or 12 years. I'm trying to remember. Quite a few years. 17 years, that was it. And part of Lansdowne Church. But I moved up here in November, got married to Rebecca in January. So we're based here in Marlow. It's been where we've been for lockdown. Both of us travel quite widely, so this has been a kind of strange time for us, really, as we found ourselves in one place for an extended period of time. And there's been nice things to that. So it's been lovely to be together, to be in a lovely part of the world. There's been some challenges too. Rebecca's job is quite uncertain at the moment. So I guess, like with many people, there's lots of uncertainties about the future. But really, my job takes me normally to universities around the UK and other parts of Europe, engaging in some of these big questions of life, big questions that current events bring up. It's a joy to be able to kind of engage in them and see how the Christian faith interacts with them. And I guess for me, that started when I was a teenager, really. So I was a teenager growing up in Leicester, in a very ethnically diverse city, which was a really enriching experience. But it meant there were all sorts of kind of beliefs and ideas around in the school that I was a part of. And as someone who had come to kind of a Christian faith early in my life, about the age of 7, it really made me kind of question for myself what I believed. And as people threw questions at me, it made me really stand up to think them through and to see whether the Christian faith really stood up to kind of objective questioning. And I think what I discovered over time was that it really does. And so it's something I love to do, really, to look at how the Christian faith, the Christian worldview interacts and engages with the kind of questions that people have.
Thanks, Michael. It's great to hear that, and it's lovely to hear that this is something which has been part of your own personal investigation of the truth and the own questions that you've had coming out of this. Now, I'm sure in the last 24 hours, all of us who've heard of those horrendous stabbings in Reading will be shocked by that. Here's a question, if you like, in response to that. Why doesn't God step in? If God's desire for us is to be free from all this brokenness, as you were speaking of just a moment ago, and if he's powerful enough to deal with it, why doesn't he step in to stop the worst of it? So there's that question. Why doesn't God step in?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Mike. And just a heads up, as you may have guessed, the talk was recorded just a couple of days ago before the events of yesterday, which is why we didn't make any mention of it in the live broadcast before now. But yes, it's terrific. Reading's just 15 miles from where we are living. It's pretty local, really. We sometimes go shopping there. So these events are huge. And I think that is a genuine question, isn't it? If there is a God who is all loving and all powerful, who could intervene in the midst of horrific evil like we saw yesterday and like we see around our world, why doesn't he intervene? Why doesn't he do something? Does he not care? Or is he not powerful? And often we don't know. The Bible shows that sometimes God does and has intervened in history. And the Bible does say that one day God will intervene and ultimately bring a final day of judgment and of justice, which is actually seen as a really good thing in the Bible, because it means that God is going to put all wrong things right. I guess one of my questions, though, is in some ways if we want God to intervene when we see evil and suffering in the world, where does he stop? I mean, I guess most of us wouldn't have any problem with God intervening in a possible terror attack and stopping that. But of course, if we just took out terrorism, we wouldn't get a world without suffering and brokenness. We would still have suffering, because it's not just terrorists who cause it. We have a world where suffering is caused by all sorts of people in all sorts of ways. And so you have to ask the question, where does God stop? Does he not just stop the terrorist, the murderer, the child abuser? What about the person who is hurting people in other ways through their words, not just their actions, and so on? And ultimately, what we'd ask for is a God who takes away all human responsibility. So it's not any longer possible for me to do what is wrong. And the problem with that is, if it's no longer possible for me to do what is wrong, if I have no responsibility, if I have no freedom, I've also made a world where there is not the possibility to act freely in choosing love either. Because love and choice, love and responsibility do go together. And so I think one of the ways God has made this world is that he has given us freedom and responsibility. That is a beautiful thing, because it means that we can freely choose to do what is good. But tragically, we can see how people can take that choice, that freedom, and use it in other ways. But as I would say, although God doesn't always intervene now, the biblical story in the big picture says that he is going to intervene one day. He's not going to allow injustice to run its course forever. He is going to bring a day of judgment. And that actually is a good thing that we can look forward to.
Thank you, Michael. That's really helpful. I want to take you up on that notion of God potentially intervening in relation to a question that Rosie Green has asked us about other faiths. Here's the question: why would you say that Christianity answers the question, why is the world so broken, better than other faiths? So it's a question really about, well, yeah, maybe you've got an answer for why the world is so broken, but why is the Christian answer the only one? And why is it better?
Absolutely, thanks. Yeah, it's a great question, because when we think about this question, all of us have to tackle it. I mean, it's not just a question for Christians, is it? Whether you consider yourself religious, whether you consider yourself an atheist, or something else, all of us are confronted with a world that seems disjointed at best and broken. And we have to work out how we're going to respond to it. And in many ways, this is one of the fundamental questions that we need to ask of any worldview or any philosophy or any religion. I touched on in the talk just earlier how actually secularism or atheism is a problem when it comes to a question like this, because it can't even kind of say that there is really ultimately anything broken about the world. This is just the way it is. And I guess you'd have to ask this question in different ways. So a Muslim might come to this kind of question of brokenness with a very, very high view of Allah's control over all things, and ultimately has to say, well, this is the will of Allah. You know, whatever happens, good or bad, it's all the will of Allah, and we don't question it. And whilst Christians do talk about God being sovereign, the creator God, a powerful God, there is a sense in which actually there are things that happen that do grieve God. It's not all in that sense just the will of God. And God is grieved by so much of what we see in the world. This world is not the way it once was. And that's very different to the Islamic kind of worldview. Similarly, if you look at, say, the Buddhist worldview, you might say, well, suffering comes because of desire. And so we need to eliminate desire. And if we can eliminate desire, then we can eliminate suffering. But again, I find that in the midst of suffering and real brokenness doesn't actually help me that much. So ultimately, I think one of the things I find really helpful, as I said, about the Christian story in response to the question is actually it just helps me to say this world really is broken. And when I look at Jesus as he walked in this broken world and see how he grieved with those who were bereaved, I think actually God is grieved too. He also sees that this world is broken. And I think that just helps me emotionally to say, actually, I don't have to say, oh, it's all okay, or it's all the will of God, and everything's fine. I can actually say, no, it's not meant to be this way. It's gone wrong. But equally, I can hold out this wonderful hope that it's not going to be this way forever. One day, this broken world's going to be put right.
Michael, thank you. We're going to go to a question now from Emily Burgess. It's about our involvement, if you like, as human beings in this pursuit of of justice itself. Here's the question: how do we balance the recognition all humans are flawed with the pursuit of justice through human, legal, political means, etc.? It's asking that question about, we're all going to make mistakes, we're all going to get stuff wrong, but what would you say is the balance between that and us needing to actually step up and get involved?
Yeah, thanks, Mike, and thanks, Emily. I think that's a really good question, and it probably gets to the heart of some of the tensions that we're seeing at the moment that have been raised, particularly by the tragic murder of George Floyd and all that's kind of happened after that. It's been something I've been thinking about over the last couple of weeks quite a lot, because it's interesting that amongst those politically on the right and the left, there is generally a complete agreement that racism is wrong. But it's interesting that often those on the left politically emphasize corporate responsibility. It's the system, it's the government, it's the structures that need to change. And we are part of a structure and part of a system, and we need to change that. Those on the right politically often emphasize the individual responsibility that we all have. We can't be held responsible for what our government does or what other nations or generations have done and so on. Each person is responsible for what they do. And I think that gets to the heart of why there's been a real tension, even amongst a lot of my friends on Facebook, over how we respond to issues of racism and justice. And I think what I find fascinating in the Bible is that it's not one or the other. And Christianity never kind of affirms that the right or the left is wholly true, but actually it's both. Interestingly, in the book of Deuteronomy in the Old Testament, we have these two statements in the same book of the Bible. One says that children will not be put to the death for the sin of their parents. It emphasizes individual responsibility. But then in the same book, we have this verse that talks about God judging the generations for the sins of their parents. And it seems like a contradiction, but when you get to statements like that in the very same book of the Bible, you say, well, maybe this is there for a purpose. And I think it's there to say, in a sense, there is individual responsibility. We shouldn't be held guilty in one sense for what we haven't done. And I think that's sometimes the danger of those on the far left. They hold groups responsible, and there's no sense of personal responsibility. But structures and systems do affect and influence us. And although it's people that sin, not systems that sin, systems are created by people and they influence people. And so at the same time, we do need to challenge structures where they're unjust and unfair. And we also need to recognize that we are not an island. We live in connection with others, and we are part of nations. And we need to recognize our responsibility is part of that too. So I think it's both ends, and I think there's a danger of emphasizing one to the exclusion of the other. I think that's why there's a lot of hostility at the moment over this issue. And I think the Christian worldview emphasizes responsibility in both of those ways.
Thank you. And just on the back of that, a question that came in earlier again about justice and so on. It was a simple question: should Christians support the Black Lives Matter movement? Obviously, that's a very pressing concern for all of us at the moment. What would be your response to that question? Should Christians support the Black Lives Matter movement?
Yeah, that's a big question, because obviously there's some kind of discussion about that. Some people say if you put hashtag Black Lives Matter, then you're signing up to everything that the Black Lives Matter movement supports, and therefore you shouldn't do it at all, and questions like that. And I think it's worth distinguishing between two things. One is to affirm the slogan or the sentiment, the idea that Black Lives Matter, which I think every Christian should absolutely want to do. Responding to that, by the way, and saying, oh, but all lives matter, really misses the point. The point of saying Black Lives Matter is not Black Lives only matter, but it's to say Black Lives Matter too. And in a context where it seems sometimes that Black Lives don't seem to matter as much, that's something that we really want to affirm. So I don't see any debate about that. But of course, Black Lives Matter is not just a hashtag, it is also a movement. You can go to their website, you can see their stated aims. And I'd have to say, as a Christian, there are a number of things about their stated aims that I have strong reservations about. And I think are actually contrary to some of the things that I would want to hold on to as a Christian. So I guess I want to make that distinction between saying I absolutely want to affirm that Black Lives Matter, but I do have reservations about the movements. But equally, when I see other Christians like hashtagging Black Lives Matter or protesting, I shouldn't assume that they are therefore endorsing everything that the movement endorses, and that can be an equal mistake.
Thanks for that, Michael. Can I move us on to a question about diversity? Here's the question, and then a comment that came with it. Doesn't Christianity undermine diversity? Here's the comment. Isn't much Christian thinking behind a lot of today's issues with injustice? Why should we listen to the Christian message when so many who are Christians seem to be intolerant? That is a view that some hold. It's a view been expressed in this question. Doesn't Christianity undermine diversity? How would you respond to that?
Wow, that's huge. I guess maybe the question, trying to think about where the question is coming from before I kind of respond to it, is the idea that Christianity makes kind of exclusive and absolute claims, and therefore it doesn't seem to be very tolerant. It makes claims like Jesus is the only way. Jesus himself said, "I am the way, the truth, the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." That seems rather arrogant, rather exclusive. It seems kind of more inclusive to say, you know, all religions are the same. They're all equally true. But I guess the difficulty is actually all truth is exclusive, and we wouldn't necessarily want to endorse every claim. You know, there's been a lot on social media and the media over the last few weeks about saying some things are absolutely wrong. Racism is absolutely wrong. So we wouldn't want to say when someone makes a racist claim, "Oh, well, that's fine. That's just, you know, what they think." We want to say, no, that's wrong. Equally, you know, when we look back through previous generations and we see racism exhibited in previous generations, no one at the moment is just saying, well, you know, that was fine, you know, for them because it was okay back then. We kind of assume that there are certain things that are evil and always evil, certain views that are wrong and always wrong. So actually, a lot of the debate we've seen assumes that there is an absolute truth, that there is an idea that some things can be absolutely right, some things are absolutely wrong or evil. And so that's just the nature of truth. And if we lose that, I think we are into dangerous territory. By the way, there's only really 4 views you can have when you come to religion. You can basically say that they're all true, every single one of them. You might want to say that some of them are true, but exclude some of the more wacky ones or the ones you don't like. You could say that one religion is true. Christians would normally say that, but of course Muslims would say that too, and perhaps others as well. Or you say that none of them are true. You're an atheist and there is no spiritual dimension at all. By the way, it's often seen that view number 3 is the arrogant one. You know, how can you say only one religion is true? But actually, in a sense, they're all arrogant, aren't they? If you say all religions, or all exclusive rather, not arrogance. If you say all religions are true, you're saying that the people who say that some of them, one of them, and none of them are true are wrong. If you say that some of them are true, you're saying the people who say that all of them, one of them, and none of them are true are wrong, and so on. Whatever your view about religion, it's going to end up being exclusive. You can't avoid that. You can't agree with everyone all of the time. It's just not possible. But, and if I can just kind of go on from the question, sorry, this is a longer answer, but just really want to say this. If you think that Christianity is this monocultural thing, and actually you need to realize that that is just not the case. Christianity didn't originate as a white Western middle class thing. And actually today in the world, it certainly isn't a white Western middle class thing. And if you look at the parts of the world where the Christian church is exploding with growth, in Africa, in Iran, in Algeria, in parts of the world that are not white, Western, and middle class, we see that that's just not the case at all. And in fact, the Bible has this incredible picture of the future of where every tribe, nation, and tongue will be brought together in unity and equality. It's a wonderful picture of diversity. So when people, by the way, talk about being colorblind, which is a phrase that people have often used, you know, we don't want to take into account people's skin color or ethnic diversity. I want to say as a Christian, that's completely wrong, because the Bible takes into account our ethnic diversity and says that that's a good thing. And then the whole picture of the new creation is going to be this celebration of our diversity and the richness that we will bring from our different cultures into that. So I would say, actually, the Bible has this wonderful, wonderful picture of diversity. And look at the early church 2,000 years ago. One of the main churches in a place called Antioch had this incredibly diverse leadership. of people who are white and black and from different ethnic origins working and serving together, which was incredibly countercultural. And the church is meant to represent something of that beautiful diversity that we see.
Michael, thank you. We're going to move to a question now from Luke Hammond. It comes in two little messages. And really it refers to the talk that you gave just before this Q&A. So if you've joined us just recently, we're doing this live Q&A in response to a talk that Michael gave in a service at Lansdowne Church just a few minutes ago, entitled, "Why is the World So Broken?" And here's Luke's question. Thanks for your talk. Lots of people tell me they see humankind as the solution to our problems. When we could just educate everyone or rally together, eliminate racism, build the technology, then we would conquer our problems. And they can often see good evidence for amazing human resilience and problem solving. Why would you say someone with that view still needs God? And I guess this question really is asking, we can see humanity doing so much, achieving so much. And in the context of a broken world, why do we really still need God anyway?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it kind of taps into an assumption, particularly in the West often, that as humanity moves forward, we are basically building this better world. And we see how, there's this kind of growth in society. You can see it in all sorts of ways, in terms of standard of living, eradicating poverty, eliminating or vastly reducing child mortality and so on. And therefore we are heading towards a kind of utopian future. And certainly the idea that certain people would have, the book behind me, Sapiens, by Yuval Noah Harari, the counterpart to that book is a book called Homo Deus, where he looks at the future and he basically has a really strong confidence in humanity's ability to radically transform our world, and particularly the ability of science to help us in that. Or if you look at a book like Steven Pinker's Enlightenment Now, you'll see this really strong case that the world is getting better. And he says, well, the Enlightenment was the reason for that, so that we basically got rid of irrational religion, we embraced rationality through atheism, and we're making the world better. That's the answer. So it's a kind of common idea. And actually, on one level, I want to say there are many ways in which the world has got better. So I won't want to discount that. I think sometimes Christians can always be rather negative and always want to be kind of stressing how broken our world is. And we want to celebrate and say, yeah, there are some wonderful advances that we have made. And we're not to downplay those advances. And that is a really good thing. But I guess my two questions would be, firstly, what is the cause of that advance? Why has our world in some ways got so much better? Is it, as Steven Pinker says, because we've all got rid of God and we've all become incredibly rational? I actually just want to challenge that narrative, really, and say that's not necessarily the case. Firstly, the Enlightenment wasn't a purely atheistic initiative anyway. And actually, if you read a book by another historian called Tom Holland, a secular historian, he basically, in this book called Dominion, says it really is the influence of Christianity upon the world that has transformed our world in so many ways, in terms of the growth of science, in terms of this conviction about human rights, and in so many other areas. Christianity is the thing that shapes that. So it's not liberating ourselves from Christianity that has made a better world. He says it's the influence of Christianity that's ingrained and pervaded our culture that's really transformed things. But I think also we just need to acknowledge, for all our advancements, there are some basic questions that still remain the same, questions about human nature. And education alone doesn't seem to change human nature. Education alone isn't going to eradicate suffering completely. Education alone is not going to eliminate humanity's greatest problem of death. And so whilst we want to celebrate ways in which our world is a better world than maybe it once was, we also want to have a degree of humility that says, actually, there are certain things that we cannot and won't be able to sort out. And that's why I find Jesus is so incredibly relevant. People often say to me, oh, Jesus, he's irrelevant, don't care about Jesus. And I think, well, look, Jesus claimed that he was the answer to death. We live in a world where 1 out of 1 people die. I find that incredibly relevant. Jesus claimed to be able to deal with that destructive side to human nature and set us free from this Bible idea, sin, this destructive stuff in us. As we look at a world of selfishness and greed and injustice, I think that's incredibly relevant. So absolutely, let's celebrate how things are better, but let's wonder why that is the case. And let's see how actually Jesus is incredibly relevant into speaking into those massive problems that we still see in humanity that only he can really answer.
Well, thinking about him being, as you've said, so relevant to us, I wonder if we could go to two questions along a similar line, but given in a very personal way. So Kathy Wilson, first of all, says, how do you know if you're on the right path, if what you're doing is what God intends? And then with that, I also want to put a question from Rachel Williamson. Again, it seems to come across really personal here. How do you help someone rediscover God after rejecting him through things that have happened in life? So it's a real life context here. How do you know, from Kathy, you're on the right path? And then here, how do you help someone if they're rejecting God because of stuff that's gone wrong, stuff that's happened in their lives?
Yeah, I think those are two really good questions. I'll try and take them probably separately because they're slightly different, but I'll start with the first one first, which seems like a good place to start. How do I know I'm on the right path? I think that question has been perhaps made even more relevant over the last few weeks as we suddenly start reflecting on maybe previous generations and what previous generations have done and said and thought. And it makes us think, actually, how do I know what I think now and the way that I live now is right? Here's a scary thought. In 50 years' time, are there things that we do and say now that will seem abhorrent to people in the future? And if history teaches us anything, the answer is probably yes. So how do we know? Do we just go with the consensus of society, see what the majority of people on Facebook say and regurgitate that? Well, the challenge is that often the majority of society has been wrong, hasn't it? So, at a time when slavery began to be abolished in the UK, at least, there were lots of people, in fact, the majority of people who thought it was fine. So how did someone break out of that? How did someone challenge the prevailing mood? And actually, to do that, you have to have a belief that there is an objective standard of what is right and wrong that is above me and above you and above even our society and our governments. And as a Christian, I have that because I say, actually, there is a God who stands above all, who tells me what is ultimately right and wrong, what is good and bad, and how I should live. And therefore, I can look to him and I can see what that is because I can see it revealed in the Bible, but also embodied in the person of Jesus. If I want to know what it looks like to truly live life as it was meant to be lived, I look at Jesus who lives it out in flesh and blood. And I see how he counterculturally challenged the ideas of his day, but I also see how he counterculturally challenges so many perceptions and ideas through history and today as well. So I'd say I need to have something objective to look at, to look to. In Jesus, I have that. That will sometimes mean being countercultural. It will sometimes mean going against the flow. It did mean that for people in history. It will mean that today. But actually, that is one way that I think we can have real confidence, that we're not just being swept along with what necessarily the majority think. Doesn't mean the majority are always wrong, of course, but I think we need to have an objective standpoint. But also, wonderfully, I want to say on that actually we will realize when we start to look at Jesus, we have all failed. And the wonderful thing is that actually Jesus doesn't simply come as an example that we should follow, because if that was it, we're all completely stuffed. But Jesus came not just as an example to be followed, as someone who came to rescue us, our own failings, from our own greed, from our own destructiveness. And we see in Jesus this offer of forgiveness. And I find it wonderful. Actually, none of us lived quite how we should. None of us have always followed the right path. But in Jesus, we can receive forgiveness and the help to do what is right in the future, increasingly. But the other question, which is kind of connected, but what do I do if I need to rediscover God because I've rejected him in the past? Particularly, I guess, if that rejection has come because maybe I feel hurt by things that have happened. It's interesting, at the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic, there was a lot of talk about how people were praying more. And there was a study done by the University of Denmark that showed that as cases of coronavirus increased, the number of Google searches for the word prayer also increased. And so it seemed like, in response to coronavirus, everyone was praying. But actually, another survey showed that for everyone who started praying because of coronavirus, another person stopped praying because of it. And I think that shows that actually, in response to suffering and pain in the world, one of two things often happens. We can either turn to God or we can turn away from God. Very rarely will we stay neutral. It's normally one or the other. And sometimes people will turn away because they feel bitter, because they feel hurt, because of what has happened to them. And in some ways, I can completely understand that idea and why that would happen. And I guess to someone, I want to say, firstly, like I said earlier in the talk, if you were watching, getting rid of God doesn't get rid of the problem. Actually, it creates another problem. Why do we even feel that our world is so broken if there is no God, if there is no ultimate right and wrong, if there is no justice? Why do we even have that sense? As a Christian, at least I can say this world is broken. It is not the way it should be. But also, I just urge you to look at how God has revealed himself. And the symbol of Christianity, remember, is a cross, a symbol of oppression and injustice, but not God unjustly oppressing others, but God becoming oppressed, experiencing injustice and suffering for us. And at the heart of the Christian faith is a God who does that, who stands with us in our pain, in our suffering, in our weakness. And as Jesus dies on the cross, he cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? The one question we want to ask in the midst of suffering is why? And at the middle of the Christian faith, we have a God who suffers for us and with us and echoes that question of why. And as I look at the cross and I look at Jesus, I see a God who I can continue to trust. And there's a beautiful verse in the New Testament. It says, he who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also along with him graciously give us all things? In other words, if God was willing to give us the most precious thing he had, his son, if God was willing to go to the greatest lengths possible, horrific crucifixion and death on a cross, for me, for you, because he loves us, then whatever the answer is to those mysterious questions of life for which we don't yet have the answer is not that he doesn't love us, because he does. And so I'd urge you to look again at Jesus and to look again at the cross.
Michael, thank you. We've run up against our time limit now. We're so grateful to have you with us. And what I'd perhaps suggest for you, if you've tuned in today and you'd like to find out more, there's some simple things that you can do. You could email us using welcome@lansdownchurch.uk. We'd be glad to send you a Bible and some Christian literature, or perhaps even more so to connect you with someone so you can continue this investigation. As we've mentioned already this morning, we've got Open the Bible sessions centrally on Tuesday evenings and Thursday mornings. But it's something you can very easily do with an individual, one of your friends as well, if you'd like to. Again, get in touch with us and we can give you more information on that. Well, Michael, thank you for joining us today. We're really grateful for everything you've shared. And we look forward to connecting with you again at some point in the future. If you've been watching, thank you for being part of our Q&A today. We'll see you all again. Take care. God bless. Goodbye.
Thank you.